Welcome to this YSL tutorial. In this video, we'll teach you about the basics of using object variables in Excel VBA. We'll begin the video with a quick look at how you declare object variables and how that differs slightly from basic data type variables, and also how you can then set a reference to an object using the set keyword. Once we've covered the basics, we'll move on and show you a couple of neat tricks for creating and referencing new objects at the same time. And we'll finish the video with an overview of how you use methods of other objects to set references in your object variables. All sounds highly exciting, so let's get started. In a previous video, we've looked at the idea of using basic data type variables in VBA to allow you to store simple bits of information while your program runs. These could be things like a string of text, or some kind of number like an integer, or even a date and time. The three main things involved in using simple variables like this are, first of all, to declare them using the dim statement, then to store some information in the variable by assigning a value to it, in this case some text, the number 1, and the time as it stands right now. And then finally, you'd retrieve or read the information from those variables in some way. So all I've done in this simple example to demonstrate the principle is to read the values of the variable into a message box so that it appears on the screen. In this video, I'd like to take this a little bit further and look at the idea of object variables. Object variables don't just store a simple data point, like a piece of text. They actually store a reference to an entire object in VBA. And an object can be one of a huge number of different things. To demonstrate how object variables work and how they differ from basic data type variables, we'll start by showing you how you can store a reference to a range of cells in a variable. The range of cells that we're going to store, I can quickly show you back on, if I switch back to Excel, is a list of film names. So essentially it's everything from cell B3 down to the end of the current list, which at the moment is B15. So, to get started with that, in the Visual Basic Editor, I'm going to begin a new subroutine. I'm going to call it store range of cells. And what we need to do first, as we do with our basic data type variables, is we need to declare the type of variable that we want to use. So I'm going to say dim, let's say film names, or film name cells would be a better, more descriptive word actually. So dim film name cells as, and then in this list of options, essentially to store an object, you're looking for anything which has this kind of symbol listed next to it. The type of object I'd like to store in this variable is something called a range, which is VBA's way of referring to a range of cells, whether that's a single cell or a block of them. So dim film name cells as range. What I then need to do is store a reference to the correct range of cells in that variable. So this is similar to what we were doing with our basic data type variables, where we assign a value. Now here's one of the big major differences between object variables and basic data type variables. Whereas with a basic data type variable, you simply state its name and then set it to be equal to something. With an object variable, you always have to use the word set before you refer to the variable name. If I press Ctrl and space here to display my IntelliSense list, that's a neat way to see my variable name appear. Set film name cells equal to, and here's a simple way to do it, range B3 colon B15. So that's how to store a reference to an object in a variable. What we can then do subsequently, if we ever want to do anything to that object, is that rather than referencing it directly, we've got a nice shortcut, simple way to do it. If I press Ctrl and space, and I look for film name cells in the list, I could say, for instance, then maybe I want to change their font color. So I could say .font .color equals, I don't know, RGB blue, for instance. So there's the basic principles of using an object variable. You can see there's essentially the same three stages as with a basic data type variable. You need to declare one first, making sure it's the correct type. Then you need to assign a value to it, or in this case a reference to an object. And the important thing is not to forget the word set. And then finally, you can do something with that object variable. In this case, because I've used a range variable, I can do anything to this object that I could do to any range of cells. So that's, in this case, changing the font color. So if you just quickly step through this routine so you can see that it works, if I use the F8 key to start it, as always it will skip over the declaration of your variable, that's not an executable line of code, and jump straight to the point where it stores the reference to the object. When I press F8, I've now got a reference to range B3 to B15 stored in that variable. So finally, if I hit F8 on this line, we should see in the background that the font colours of all those cells turn blue. So there's the basics. The simple example that we've covered so far probably isn't quite enough yet to convince you of the advantages of using object variables. So let's see if we can make this a bit more complicated and show you why they're so worthwhile using. I'm going to change the way that we refer to or set a reference to a range of cells. Rather than making it explicitly refer to B3 to B15, I'd like this to be able to refer to B3 to whichever cell is at the end of the list. So in this case it is currently B15, but if we extend our list, I would like to make sure that the reference includes the extra cells. So to make that work, what we're going to do is say range B3, comma, range B3, get that right, dot end, XL down. Hopefully you've seen our previous video on referring to ranges and selecting cells. If so, this should make sense to you at least. If not, the video is always there if you need a quick recap. So, simply, what this system does now is if I add any new films to the end of my list, this single line here will ensure that it always includes every film from top to bottom. This is brilliant when you want to do lots of different things to the same block of cells. If I was constantly having to refer to this relatively complex range, it'd be quite awkward to type in time after time after time. All I need to do in this system now, however, is because I have it stored in a simple variable with a sensible name, and I can use my IntelliSense list to get it to be essentially typed in for me, film name cells dot, let's see, font dot italic equals true. So hopefully it's fairly obvious what that one's going to do. And if I use the F8 key to step through, in fact I should probably add a film or two to the end of the list, shouldn't I, just to make sure that it actually does work. Let's add Gravity and 12 Years a Slave as well. Two films that I haven't quite got round to seeing yet, but everyone I've spoken to says they're absolutely fantastic. So back into the Visual Basic editor, if I step through the routine, we won't notice the colour change, of course, because that's already happened, but when we assign this line, this will happen to all of the films from top to bottom, including the two new ones that I've just added. Another quite useful feature of this particular object variable is that now that we've stored a reference to the range of cells, we can move away to other parts of our workbook or even into a completely different workbook altogether, and yet still have a nice simple way to make changes to the properties of that object. So if in between setting the cells and then doing something to them, we, for instance, move to a different worksheet. Let's see, I'm going to pick sheet 2, sheet 2.activate. It doesn't even matter that we're not on the same worksheet anymore. We can still modify properties of our film name cells object by referring to it in the same way as we did earlier. So let's change the colour we're using just to prove that this actually works. We'll go with RGB red this time, I think, and let's change the italic property back to false so we can see that it definitely works. Again, if I step through the routine, while you can see Excel in the background, we've stored the range of cells, having been on worksheet 1 when the subroutine began, but then we move away to a different worksheet. These two lines you won't actually see happen, of course, because we're not on the worksheet, but if I do switch back to sheet 1, you can see that the font has turned red and it's no longer in italics. You can extend this to even working in completely different workbooks. It genuinely doesn't matter where you are physically in Excel when your code is running. This keyword, this variable name, always refers to the original block of cells that you stored. Often a good reason for using object variables is when you're creating new objects in code, but you're not sure what the name of those objects will be. So for instance, if I inserted a new worksheet, I wouldn't necessarily know what its sheet name would be, and if I wanted to refer to it in code, I'd need some sort of better way to do that. So to demonstrate what I mean, we're going to create a little system that inserts a new worksheet, and then we switch back to sheet 1, copy some data from this one, and then go back to the new worksheet that we've created. It's not necessarily the most efficient way to do this, but it's a nice way to demonstrate how object variables work again. So back into the VB editor, I've already begun a new subroutine called referencing a worksheet in a variable, and the first thing we need to do is declare a variable. I'm going to call it myNewSheet, which will store a type of object called a worksheet. What we can then do is apply the add method to the worksheets collection, and that will generate a brand new worksheet, but we won't know what its name will be. We do know that it will become the active sheet whenever we insert a new one. So once we've inserted it, we can set my new sheet to be equal to the active sheet. So at this point we don't actually need to know what its sheet name is at all. It doesn't really matter. We have a simple reference to it with our myNewSheet variable. What that means now is that I can switch back to sheet 1 where I know all my data is stored. So I can say sheet1.activate, and I could say, oh, I know, let's do something quite quick and simple, range A1.current region, and again hopefully you've seen the video on referencing cells that explains what that means, current region.copy. Then I can switch back to my new sheet and say active cell.paste, or sorry, paste special in fact. Current region, by the way, just to quickly explain, current region is if you have a single cell selected or referred to, it's like if you press the Control and A keyboard shortcut, it references the entire region of data in which the referenced cell sits. So back to the VBA editor, what we can do now is if I step through the routine, and in fact I'll make sure you can see a little bit, at least the sheet names in the background, we can use F8 to start stepping through. So we'll add a new worksheet. It is, in this case, sheet 4. We store a reference to that new sheet in the myNewSheet variable, and then switch back to sheet 1. We copy the current region of data, and then at this point, without the object variable, we simply wouldn't know how we could get back to the new sheet that we created, because we couldn't guarantee that it would always have been called sheet 4. So the object variable makes this sort of thing much, much more simple, and the end result is a set of copied data into our new sheet. Now it's worth mentioning that there is a slightly more efficient way that we could have set the reference to the new worksheet that we've created. If I just head to the end of the add method and type in a space to expose the parameter list, what you can see at the very end of the parameter list is when it says as object. Now what this means is that the add method has two different jobs. As well as actually creating and adding the new worksheet, it also returns a reference to the object that gets created. What that means is that we can combine these two lines rather than adding the new sheet and then setting a reference to it. We can actually do the two things in one go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move or cut worksheets.add from that line and replace the reference to active sheet here. So it's a little bit odd to actually do that, but this line now has two completely different jobs. It adds the new worksheet, as it did previously, but it also then sets a reference to the worksheet that has been added. So the add method is behaving like a function. It returns something. The code will work in exactly the same way, however, as it did previously. What we'll see if we step through again, so we'll create a brand new worksheet. This one will be sheet 5. Then we go back to sheet 1, copy some data, back to whatever the new sheet was. So in this case it is sheet 5, and then paste the data in as it did previously. So there we go, a quick shorthand way of creating a new object and setting a reference to that object in an object variable. It's probably worthwhile mentioning at this point that this technique I've just shown you, whereby you can create a new object and set a reference to it at the same time, can be used with a variety of other object types. So just to quickly show you what I mean by that, a quick couple of other examples or other EGs. If I declare a variable called myNewBook as a workbook, if I wanted to create a new workbook and set a reference to the one that I've just created, I can say set myNewBook, try that again, myNewBook equals workbooks dot add. And the reason I know that I can do that is if I open a set of parentheses after the add method to expose the parameter list, it shows me that the add method returns a reference as a workbook. So the result of the add method is adding the new workbook, but also returning a reference to it. Similarly with charts, I can do the same thing. I could say dim my new chart as a chart, and then I could say set my new chart equal to charts.add. And again, if I open a set of parentheses after the add method, so that you can see the add method has a parameter list, but it also returns a reference as an object, which means that its result can be stored in an object variable. As one final example of using object variables, we're going to write a small system that allows a user to search for a film in our list. When they find the film, it returns some basic information about what that film is. So to make that work, we'll head back into the Visual Basic editor, and I've already begun a simple new subroutine called finding a range. And to start with, we're going to add two basic variables. The first one will simply be a basic string variable called film to find, and this is going to store the name of the film that the user wants to find as a string. The second variable will be called dim film cell, and this is the variable that will store the reference to the range in which the film lives. So dim film cell as a range. To prompt the user to type in a film name, we're going to use an input box, and to make that work we need to say film to find. Because it's a basic data type variable, we do not use the word set to store information in a data type variable, so film to find equals input box, and then I'll tell the user to type in a film name. Quick and simple. At that point, what I want to do is take the value stored in that variable and search for it in the list of cells on sheet 1. So I'm going to say range B3, comma range B3 dot indexL down, as we saw earlier on, and that will refer to the range of cells from the top to the bottom of the list. What I'd then like to do is apply the find method to that range of cells, so dot find, then open some parentheses, and the thing that I want to find, the what parameter, will be what I've typed in and stored in my variable earlier on, film to find. Can you also see at the end of the parameter list for the find method, there's another one of these little hints that this method also returns something, and it returns a reference to a range, and it will always be the range in which the value you're looking for has been found. So, as well as actually performing the find method, what I would like to do is store the result in the film cell variable. In order to do that, at the start of the sentence I'm going to say set film cell equals, and then that will become the result of the find method. Let me just see if I can squeeze this onto one single screen with. I'm going to use the continuation character so that you can see all this on one single screen with. If I use a space and an underscore, it allows me to continue typing one instruction across multiple lines. So there we go. That line will store the result of the find method in the film cell variable. The final thing that I'd like to do in this example is show a message to the user which explains what's been found. So I'm going to use a message box which will show me the value of the film cell and also which cell reference it has. So to do that, I can refer to my film cell variable and find one of its properties. The first one will be the value. Then I'm going to concatenate a little string of text using the ampersand symbol, and in a set of double quotes I'm going to say was found in, and then finally another ampersand, and this time I want to refer to the cell reference of the film cell, and that's a property called address. So the final message, if for instance I was looking for the Hobbit and I found the Hobbit, the final message would be to say the Hobbit was found in cell B7. Okay, so if I want to see if the system works, we can use the F8 key to step through. The input box will appear to ask me what film I want to type in, and let's go with Hobbit to begin with. Click OK. What will happen now, you can see currently if I hover the mouse over the film cell variable that at the moment there's nothing stored in there. If I hit F8 again, however, the film cell now contains the cell in which the word Hobbit has been found. So the final result, the message box will say exactly what I expected. Now there is one small problem left over with this simple subroutine. That's if the film cell variable doesn't contain it, if we don't find the film we're searching for. So if I use F5 to step through this one quickly, and if I search for, so just complete nonsense I guess, that's the easiest way to demonstrate it, we'll find that the system falls over. And the reason that this falls over is because my object variable has not been set. So I'm trying to read some information or a property of an object when the object doesn't actually exist at this point. So there is no cell in which that string of text exists. Really the way to get around this is to use an if statement to only display this message if the film cell has been set. So what we're going to do very, very quickly is show you the basics of an if statement. We'll have a much longer video on ifs at a later stage, but just to show you the basic principle, I can test if film cell is, And if you remember, you saw the word nothing earlier on when we were stepping through our subroutine. The first time you execute a subroutine, an object variable contains the word nothing. So if film cell is nothing, then I want to show a message which says that film was not found. Or in fact, even better, film to find and was not found. Else, I'm going to display the message that we've just created. And finally, we want to say end if. So that's the basic structure of an if statement. You test a logical statement. If that condition is true, then you would perform this action. And if that statement wasn't true, you would perform this action instead. Okay, so let's give it one more try. If I run the subroutine using the F5 key rather than F8, I won't bother stepping through. Let's look for spider this time. We'll find the amazing Spider-Man was found in cell B9, which there it is. And if I run it again and search for complete rubbish, it tells me that that was not found. So there's a quick, almost complete example of using object variables to store references to objects. Hope you found the video useful. Thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this training video, you can find many more online training resources at www.wiseowl.co.uk.